In the final footnote of his classic essay, Encounters in the Agora, Paul Millett pointed out that other places have their agoras with a capital A. He cites, for example, the Garden House of Suleiman the Red, an exotic fictional locale in John Buchan's Greenmantle set in Istanbul. And he cites an equally exotic real locale, the Tea Room in the University Library, Cambridge. Quoting Buchan, he says of these places, the ends of the earth converge there. There may be something to this observation. Herodotus, at least, seems to have thought that other places, non-Greek places, do have their agoras, even if he is sometimes quoted as having the opposite view, that the agora is a peculiarly Greek place. To sort out this contradiction, I would like to begin and end in Egypt, but we'll have to visit a few other places along the way. When Herodotus visited Egypt later in the 5th century BCE, he saw more wonders there than in any other land. Among the sites he visited in gathering material for his work were several Egyptian temples, grand monuments that were already ancient in his day. These included temples at capital cities such as Memphis, Thebes, and Sais, but he singles out the one at Bubastis as the most beautiful he has seen and gives an extensive description. And these are on your handout. Of course, most of the texts are on your handout. There's a temple of Bubastis that is exceedingly remarkable. There are greater temples and temples on which more money has been spent, but none that is more of a pleasure to look upon. Bubastis in Greek is Artemis. This is the nature of her temple. Except for the entrance, it is an island. For from the Nile extend canals which do not mingle with one another, but each runs as far as the entrance of the temple, and then one runs round this way and the other that way, each being 100 feet wide and shaded with trees. The height of the front gateway is 60 feet, and it is decorated with 9-foot-high figures worth mentioning. Since it is in the middle of the surrounding city, one looks down on the temple from all directions. For as the city was mounded up and the temple was not moved from where it was since the beginning, it is viewed from above. A wall runs around it, carved with images. Within is a grove planted with huge trees around a great shrine in which is the image. The width and the length of the temple is about 200 yards. At the entrance, there is a road laid of stone running for about 1/3 of a mile through the marketplace toward the east, and in breadth it is 400 feet. On both sides of the road are trees towering to the sky, and the road leads to the Temple of Hermes. Such is the temple. What Herodotus saw, and there's the Greek, of course, which you have. What Herodotus saw on his visit to Bubastis can, to a limited extent, be found in the remains of Tel Basta, which is located in modern Zagazig and has been investigated periodically since the late 19th century. Areas of it are still being excavated and surveyed, and this recent work includes a study of the temple in its immediate urban context. Except for a few exaggerated dimensions, the remains appear to conform more or less to Herodotus's description of a major temple situated in the midst of a town with a road running eastwards from the main gate. More work remains to be done there to uncover what precisely Herodotus may have seen of the built environment, but it would be not surprising at all if that work confirms Herodotus's impression of a centrally located temple and a road leading from its gates through the middle of town. The orientation of a town around the temple and a main road leading from its gates is a fairly common layout in late Pharaonic Egyptian and earlier urban sites. While the excavation of settlement sites in Egyptian archaeology has, with notable exceptions, generally taken second place to the exploration of temple complexes and other monumental architecture, more recent excavations at sites in the Fayum, such as Narmuthis or Medinet Madi and Soknapionessos and Dime, have mapped in greater detail the central location of temples and their dromoi in relation to their urban context. And there are other excavations as well, Edfu, for instance, for earlier periods and so on. So here are just some pictures so we can set the stage a little bit and imagine this place. Narmuthis here has been excavated quite well, and you can see how, if I zoom in there a little bit, you can see the sanctuary in the sort of upper left corner of the plan with a dromos running down from it, and a kind of a rough grid plan emerging from it. And that central area in front of the temple was kind of the center of town. Here's a view from of the dromos at Medinet Madi, and you can see the adjacent buildings, showing you where we were in the text. There's a plan of Tel Basta. Now we're going to just take a quick look here at Narmuthis and Medinet Madi, or Narmuthis or Medinet Madi, the modern name. Here's a view of the dromos leading from the front gate of the temple. We're standing on the temple looking along it, and this is where this kind of public space might have been at Tel Basta. If we look at another slide here of Soknopionesis or Dima, you can also see, zooming in, there's the sanctuary higher on the relief of the map, and a dromos or road running out from the gates and public areas there. And we can see here just an example of a paved road, a monumental paved road like the one mentioned at Tel Basta. So I'll try and resume from there and then just follow the slides along. Hopefully they're big enough to see. The texts, of course, as you know, are in the handout, so you should be able to follow along with those. Well, Herodotus, in short, saw a normal Egyptian town at Bubastis, even if it was to him extraordinarily beautiful, with its canals and shade trees and dramatic sunken setting. And by the way, there's evidence of shade trees planted along the dromos at Tebtunis as well, so he's got a parallel there. Through Herodotus's eyes, we can catch a glimpse not only of the beauty of ancient Bubastis, but the perspective of an outsider to set alongside what can be recovered from archaeological investigations. Herodotus saw the exterior of the temple, its walls and its huge gates. He gave approximate dimensions to provide a sense of the scale. He knew that an image of the goddess was within the inner shrine, even if he didn't describe it. Perhaps he never saw it. And as he so often does in his histories, he translates an unfamiliar divinity with a Greek equivalent. Elsewhere, at 260, he does describe the great festival of Bubastis, but the focus is on the public social aspects, the procession by boat to the town, the revelry, drinking, sacrifices, and huge crowds. He also applied Greek terms to features of the temple and its setting. The front gates are the propylaea, the inner shrine is the naos, and so on. He describes a broad road running eastward from the propylaea of the temple, noting that it ran through the agora of the town of Bubastis. The agora of Bubastis. Agora was and is a word to conjure with, a word with connotations. In English translations of this passage, the agora of Bubastis is often a marketplace or a main square, and these words capture some of the meanings that fill this space. In Herodotus's day and in ours, there have been still more. The agora of an ancient Greek city-state or polis is thought to have been a particular form of public space. It was an open gathering place within an urban landscape where people met for trade or informal social activities, but also for formal political, juridical, and religious proceedings undertaken by citizens, assemblies, law courts, and state officials. In the modern imagination, the agora, especially the agora of Athens, can serve as an emblem of classical Greece, or of a selective version of classical Greece that is the setting of a proto-modernity. In this vision, the agora is a central place that was more secular, rational, and democratic than other pre-modern times and places. Imagine Socrates loitering in the agora, asking his questions amid political conversations and philosophical debates, legal disputes and exchanges in an open marketplace. This is the ideal type, of course. For ordinary citizens, participation in these activities made it a training ground that equipped them to take part in politics, as Millet and others have pointed out. And Kostas Vlasopoulos has offered a more radical interpretation of the Athenian agora as one of the free spaces of the city, in which even women and non-citizens could have had some share in shaping public life and politics. So, with all that in mind, what exactly did Herodotus mean by this equation, this commensuration of Egyptian and Greek spaces? Was it only an approximation of physical forms? Did Herodotus simply mean agora as a marketplace in the economic sense? Or was he referring to a broader homology between the agora of a Greek polis and open areas at the front of an Egyptian temple? Did that homology include functions of communicative, political, and social action that are often seen as fundamental to an ancient Greek agora? If so, what was going on in the middle of Bubastis that made Herodotus think of it as an agora? How, in short, are we to translate Herodotus's translation? Gathering the evidence for the social, economic, political, and judicial activities at the gates of Egyptian temples is a much larger task than the present paper, and I'll briefly put my cards on the table. There is evidence that the public areas around temples, especially the forecourts, gates, and dromoi, functioned as public spaces not only for religious processions and festivals, but also for market activities, law courts, meetings of local councils and associations, and public communication and commemoration, the erecting of statues, stelae, decrees, and so forth. My focus here, however, is on what Herodotus wrote about agori, Greek and non-Greek, and trying to decipher what he could have meant in identifying an agora in Bubastis. So an anecdote from Herodotus is sometimes retold to bolster the essential Greekness of the agora. This is well known. The story goes that Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, told a Spartan envoy who had come to warn him against attacking Greek cities in Ionia, "I have never yet feared any men who have a place set aside in the middle of the city in which to gather together, swear oaths, and deceive one another." This royal bon mot does seem to assign the agora as a distinctive place with particular practices to the Greeks. And there's a contrast between Greek mendacity and the image of the truth-loving Persians described earlier in Book 1. On the surface, there seems to be a pretty clear cultural and ethnical distinction. Herodotus explains that Cyrus said this because of the Greek custom of setting up agorae in their cities for buying and selling, while the Persians have no such places in their cities. Not exactly correct and even contradicted by other Greek authors, but never mind. The story imagines an outsider's perspective on the Greek agora and puts it in the mouth of a Persian king, but it is a Greek joke made at the expense of Greeks, a sarcastic comment about dishonest competitive dealings in trade that is implicitly extended to law and politics as well. There's the joke. Though Herodotus singles out the economic dimensions of the agora in his explanation, the wider context of Cyrus's apothegm shows that Herodotus makes an easy glide from economic transactions to other interactions in the agora. Cyrus has just asked who these Lacedaemonians are and how many they are to command him not to interfere with the Greeks in Ionia. We may imagine that he was given a little report on the Spartans and their customs. Just before this, however, in 152, there was a scene of public oration. Pithermus, the Phocian, had donned a purple cloak in Sparta in order to draw a crowd, presumably in some public place like an agora. He assumed an orator's stance and made a long speech appealing on behalf of the Ionians and Aeolians for Spartan help against the Persians. The Spartans refused to help but sent Cyrus a warning anyway. And Cyrus, just after the most quoted part of his quotable quote, adds, "If I remain healthy, the Lacedaemonians will have troubles of their own about which to converse, rather than those of the Ionians," as if he is aware of a scene of public debate in Sparta about the Ionian situation. The glide between deceit in economics and in other public dealings in this anecdote resembles aristocratic Greek disapproval of the proximity of trade to law and politics in the agora, a sentiment that can be found in comic poets such as Aristophanes and Eubulus, and more philosophical writers such as Xenophon, and of course Plato and Aristotle. Paul Mellett, Leslie Kirk, and others have examined these attitudes. Herodotus is, to put it briefly, having the Persian king give voice to aristocratic Greek scorn for the agora as a site of indiscriminate mixing in politics and economics. Is the focalization through Cyrus, at least in part, meant to color an aristocratic sentiment as tyrannical? And if the message to be taken from this quote is that the agora is characteristically Greek, why is it made through a negative characterization of Greeks in aristocratic Greek terms? The content and the focalization of the anecdote make it anything but a straightforward use of the agora to mark cultural difference. Herodotus does point to a Greek-Persian dichotomy, but he is also making another point about cross-cultural comprehension and recognition. Herodotus's Cyrus, either through stupidity or arrogance or both, misrecognizes the agora and what goes on there. You could call it a tyrannical misrecognition. Herodotus himself, despite having stated that agorae are a Greek custom, seems perfectly willing to recognize non-Greek places as agorae. To our Egyptian example from Bubastis can be added some illuminating comments on agorae in Babylon and Sardis, and a passing mention of one in the Phrygian city of Kalini, which I won't really go into. The translations and commentaries will sometimes assume that when writing of a non-Greek agora, Herodotus means the word in the limited economic sense of marketplace, as I've said. Everyone engages in trade, but there's an implicit line drawn that separates the proto-modern democratic Greek agora from other such sites. For Herodotus, however, some activities in the foreign agorae of Babylon and Sardis are not incommensurable with those of the ideal Greek agora. Oops. Down, there we go. Our Greek historian, for example, praises a Babylonian medical custom. The Babylonians, he says, do not use doctors. Instead, they bring those who are suffering illness into the agora, where passers-by offer advice based on their own experiences and observations, and everyone is required to stop and ask what ails the sick person. There is an expectation that in this public area, the people of Babylonia will share information and help one another. We may guess that it is the idea of collective wisdom that Herodotus appreciates in this Babylonian crowdsourcing of medical advice, and above all, the mutuality that it entails. This is, he says, the second wisest custom of the Babylonians, the wisest being another exercise in mutuality, the lapsed custom of the bride auction that he described just before in 196, a custom still followed in his day, so he says, by the Enetoi of Illyria. There's no explicit mention of an agora in his description of the Babylonian bride auction, but there is a place, koion, where the young women are gathered in a crowd, around which stands an assembly, homilos, of men. The auction was, to Herodotus, a beneficial arrangement, since gold from the sale of the most beautiful brides provided dowries for the less attractive or disabled. These dowries were set and dispersed through a reverse auction in which the less desirable bride would go to the man willing to accept the least amount of gold along with her. The lapse of this admirable system, patriarchal oppression notwithstanding, and its replacement by another, is loosely linked in Herodotus's ethnography to the Persian conquest. As a result of the ruin and impoverishment of the Babylonians, he says, any man of the common people who is lacking a livelihood simply prostitutes his female children. In this new practice, there is no concern for creating a social good through carefully instituted complementary and mutually beneficial exchanges, just a degrading transaction born of material desperation. Following just after Herodotus's account of the bride auction and its replacement, the Babylonian agora, as a clearinghouse for medical information, conveys a similar contrast between mutual aid among, dare we say, citizens and individual consultations with medical doctors. Herodotus does not describe the Babylonian agora as a site of political deliberations as such, but it is a central public place in which relations between members of a community, in this case positive and beneficial relations, are enacted. The descriptions of these particular customs, I hasten to add, have, as far as I know, found little support in historical evidence from Mesopotamia, but for the moment, it is enough to say that Herodotus imagines that something like an agora, capital A, could exist there. Herodotus also mentions an agora in Sardis, capital city of the Lydian kingdom and later an Achaemenid satrapal center. Herodotus's histories have played a confusing role in sorting out the topography of the complex archaeological site of Sardis. In his account of the Ionian assault on the city in 498 BCE, he describes the Lydians and the Persians crowding into the agora through which the Pactolus River runs, where they were forced to make a stand, and this is at 5101. The excavated areas along the Pactolus were, in part for this reason, thought to be the center of the city. You can see the Pactolus is that little blue line kind of running through. But excavations in the 1990s showed that, in fact, the massive Lydian city walls surrounded an area to the north of the Acropolis, which is in the lower right of your plan there, and to the east of the Pactolus. There was nevertheless an extensive settled area outside the walls along the Pactolus, including the Temple of Artemis, that's down there in the sort of bottom. And it is plausible that the Agora of Sardis was outside the city walls in the Persian period, as Herodotus sort of hints in his description. Where it was in the Lydian period is less clear, since according to Nick Cahill, there is significant discontinuity in the archaeological record after the Persian capture of Sardis in 547. Nevertheless, there was an agora in the Lydian capital, at least according to Herodotus's tale of Croesus and his ill-fated son Attis. In contrast to the Babylonian agora, the reference to the Lydian one suggests something of the competitive reciprocity that Millet identifies as a key feature of the Athenian agora. It was a place for rivalry, where citizens put their standing at risk. Actually, Millet cites this very passage in support of his notion. The story is well known. When Attis discovers that the Mysians have asked Croesus to send him along to help catch the boar that has been ravaging their lands, and that his father has refused, Attis sees this as a slight. He asks, "How shall I show my face going into the agora and out of the agora?" What sort of a man will I seem to the citizens? What sort of a man to my newly wedded wife? What sort of man will she think she's living with? It sounds a bit hysterical, actually. Herodotus has Attis articulate a neat complementary pairing: the domestic familial world and the world of relations with one's fellow citizens. In this case, competitive relations in the agora, where there is a public estimation of one's standing. So even in a monarchical non-Greek state, Herodotus imagines that reputation in the agora matters to a royal son, or can at least plausibly be invoked to win an argument with his dad. These two examples suggest that Herodotus did imagine that other cities and other people, other places could have their own agorae, and they were not simply marketplaces. They could be places where people engaged in other aspects of public life that are comparable to the life of the Greek agora. It would be a stretch to say that Herodotus assumes the agora as a cultural universal, but there are hints of that in his occasional use of the agora as a reference point for a human social temporality. He refers to the filling and the emptying of the agora to mark the time roughly from mid-morning until the height of the day. Xerxes, for example, waits until the filling of the agora before he makes his final assault on the 300 at Thermopylae at 7-223. In his account of the Ammonians in Libya, he observes that their marvelous spring of the sun runs with warm water at dawn, but cooler water at the filling of the agora, and very cold water at midday. The marvelous thing is, of course, that as the day gets hotter, the spring gets colder. In India, things are different. The hottest part of the day is during the morning until the dissolution of the market, so that the local people are said to soak themselves in water at that time to make it bearable. This is in 3:104, our passage here. Perhaps implicit in this comment is the idea that they are out and about at this time. This comes in the context of the discussion of the gold dinging ants that we sort of have talked about sometimes. In other words, perhaps their social rhythms, their nomos, is the same as the rest of the world, even if the phusis of their day is different. Naturally, in all these examples, we may well wonder whether Herodotus is making human universals out of his own Greek ideas, values, and experiences, as modern Euro-American social scientists have so often done. That is a question I'll try to hold open for the moment. There are, however, clearer distinctions to be made between Herodotus's rough commensuration of particular forms and concepts across cultures, even if it does involve a presumptuous universalism, and an assertion of extreme difference. They have no agoras, or a tendentious misrecognition. An agora is a special place expressly for deceit, cheating, and false oaths. The human social rhythms of the agora bring us back to Egypt in a desultory Herodotean way, and to the pharaoh Amasis, a Philhellene and a bit of a rogue. According to Herodotus, Amasis had a daily regimen. He would get up early and work zealously on all the business that was brought to him until the time when the market filled up. And from that time forward, he would spend the day drinking and making jokes with his companions. This led to concern for his reputation among his friends. Amasis followed the rhythms of the agora, and perhaps there is an elusive link between his disreputable but ultimately wise routine, the agora, and his common background. Perhaps Herodotus even wanted to mark him as agoraios. Elsewhere, Amasis was willing to put his reputation at risk in public settings in the anecdote of the divine statue he made out of his golden footbath, and the lesson he draws from it about his common background. That's at 2:172. Herodotus also reports that before Amasis became king, he had been a drinker and a joker as well, and would steal party supplies when he ran out. He would be caught, he would deny it, and then his accusers would bring him before whatever oracle happened to be nearby. And though he was often convicted by these oracles, he was also often acquitted. When he became king, he spurned those oracles and divinities who had been mistaken, but took special care of those who had convicted him, a kind of retrospective version of Croesus's testing of the oracles. This is all in 2:174. Here we do need to supply a bit of information or the text to set this anecdote in an urban topography. Though Herodotus is not explicit, we can perhaps imagine a public place for these thefts, denunciations, and oracular trials. If he was seeking goods for his drinking parties, he would perhaps find them and steal them in the agora. And if he was to be brought before an oracle to decide his guilt, he would be brought to the gates of a temple. This is where, in the late Pharaonic period, Egyptians petitioned oracles to settle a variety of matters, including legal cases, as commentators since at least Alan Lloyd's work in the 1970s pointed out. It was not only oracles that dispensed justice at the gates of Egyptian temples, but also panels of judges who met to hear legal disputes between members of the local community. Their workings are better documented in the Ptolemaic period, but there are earlier references in Demotic documents to these judges, who seem to have displaced earlier councils of high government officials with both administrative and judicial responsibilities, sometime in the reign of the Saite pharaoh Psammetichus I, so in the 7th century BCE. And this was probably a result of a legal reform and judicial reorganization under that pharaoh. This was a reform that presumably went along with the use of Demotic Egyptian as a chancery and administrative script. So legal proceedings could well have been a feature of the Egyptian agora, as Herodotus saw it in the 5th century BCE. Our historian, however, with the exception of Amasus's oracular trials, describes only law and justice, or injustice, as meted out by Egyptian kings when he mentions it at all. One of these kings is Sabakos, the Ethiopian king Shabaka. In Herodotus's account, this king was moderate in administering justice. He imposed no death penalties, rather he passed judgment on offenders according to the seriousness of their crime and ordered them to bring dirt to their hometowns and pile up the height of their cities. The implication appears to be that the more serious the crime, the more dirt was required. So in this way, cities were built up by the practice of a proportional justice, the imposition of palpably rational sentences. Bubastis, Herodotus speculates, appears to have benefited most from this policy, and this explains the splendid setting of the sunken temple, which one can view from the surrounding city. Well, if Herodotus witnessed trials by royal judgment or by local court at Bubastis or in other Egyptian agorae, he does not report anything about it. The examples of Sardis and Babylon have shown that he can recognize and even praise various kinds of public social functions in a non-Greek agora, but in Egypt, he makes the agora a site where differences between Greeks and Egyptians are enacted. Oops, there we go. The very first item that Herodotus mentions in his famous catalog of the inverted customs of the Egyptians is that women do the marketing and retail trade, agorazousi kai kapeliousi, while men stay at home and do the weaving. As has long been known in the plays of Aristophanes and other texts attest, the idea that there were no women in the Greek agora is more ideological proposition than reality. But all the same, Herodotus makes this a point of cultural contrast between Greek and Egyptian gender norms as enacted in both domestic and public life. In his rapid enumeration of differences, he does not pause to unravel the implications of this difference for the agora of the Egyptians. So all we can say is that Herodotus observes that they do have an agora, and it is somewhat different from what a Greek would expect. The Egyptian agora was also a place where difference could be negotiated. It was the one agora in Herodotus's histories where the ends of the earth do converge, at least in cultural terms. In his account of Egyptian sacrificial procedure, which seems to be a somewhat confused conflation of different kinds of offering and execration rituals, he notes that the Egyptians call down curses on the head of the sacrificial animal after it is slaughtered. Then, those who have an agora, and Greeks as resident merchants, take the head to the agora and sell it to them. But those who have no Greeks at hand throw the head in the river. Shortly thereafter, Herodotus explains that it is because of this practice of execration that Egyptians will not eat the heads of any creature. The focalization in this account is entirely through the Egyptians, and the Greeks are either conveniently there for the Egyptians or not, but no comment is made as to their interests or actions. If we imagine the agora as a site of competitive reciprocity in an economic sense, in which one party is trying to get the better of the other in a transaction, the focalization could lead one to read the Egyptians as the winners. They are, after all, able to realize some gain on an object that would otherwise be garbage, or worse, ritually contaminated garbage. Lucky those hapless Greeks were there. But were they hapless? Were they the unfortunate dupes of the sharp practices of Egyptians in the agora? On another reading, Herodotus could simply be pointing out that the Greeks and the Egyptians set entirely different values on an object because of their different customs. Egyptians won't eat the heads of animals because of their role in sacrificial rites, but implicitly Greeks will, or they will do something with them, make soup, I don't know. The Greeks may not know about, or they may not be much bothered by the curses that Egyptians invoke on the heads of sacrificial animals. In either case, there is a disjuncture between the cultural perspectives of those involved in the transaction. There's no shared understanding of the value of the object, and so there can be no zero-sum game of competitive exchange. There is rather a translation from one cultural world to another. Each party may or may not recognize that there are different perceptions of value at play, but they achieve a reciprocal exchange all the same. As a cross-cultural exchange, this transaction shares some characteristics with the model of translation that Dipesh Chakrabarty, in his famous essay on provincializing Europe, has described as analogous to barter exchange. In contrast to translation as commodity exchange, barter translation does not presume or stipulate a mediating universal third term, such as money, or the universalizing categories of some kinds of social scientific theory that are presumed to be common reference in all languages and cultures. Each barter exchange is a localized, rough and ready commensuration between things that may well be incommensurable. As examples, Chakrabarty points to translations and equations between Hindu gods and expressions of Islamic divinity in a range of texts and inscriptions in South Asia from the 11th to the 18th centuries CE, that take a similar approach to commensuration as Herodotus's so-called Interpretatio Graeca. If we take Herodotus's range of references to the agoras of other places and cultures, we can see that he is far from insisting that an agora have such and such formal characteristics or typical practices. If he identifies a particular place in front of the gates of the temple at Bubastis as an agora, it seems clear that he is marking equivalences or approximations while also allowing for room for cultural differences to be manifest and to be negotiated. If we dare to raise Herodotus's approach to translating the agora and translation in the agora to the level of an ethical position, and that is admittedly tenuous and speculative and relies on analogies with Herodotus's translations in other cases and contexts, we can again recall the contrast with Cyrus's position on the agora of the Greeks. To the great king, it is a place filled with cheating and lies, and so of no value. Encounters in the agora are pointless at best and probably compromise the strength and integrity of people who engage in this custom. Herodotus, to be sure, does not turn a blind eye to the potential for deception in the Greek agora or other sites of assembly. The scene I mentioned earlier of Pithermus the Phocian appealing to the Spartans has a rough parallel in Aristagoras' later mission to the Spartans and the Athenians during the Ionian Revolt, and Herodotus' statement at 597 that it was easier for Aristagoras to fool 30,000 Athenians in the agora, unless you date the Pnyx very early, than one individual Spartan king, Cleomenes. And the agora was the scene of Pisistratus' notorious pretense that he had been wounded by his enemies and needed a bodyguard, which culminated in his first bid for tyranny over Athens. In Herodotus, clearly, the unscrupulous, tyrannical leader was able to deceive the people in public contexts. Despite all the risks and problems, Herodotus is nevertheless able to find something of value in the business of the agora, and also able to recognize the agora in other places, and occasionally as a meeting place for different cultures. Cyrus, from the cultural, monarchical, and imperial position that Herodotus assigns him, is unwilling or unable to do so. As I suggested earlier, this is not purely a Greek-Persian dichotomy. The anecdote is not so much about the particularity of the Greek agora as an articulation of a very different limit case, the absence of the agora as a site of economic, social, and political transactions, and a refusal to recognize the agora as such. This does have some implications for one of the basic questions which I began with. What does Herodotus mean when he mentions the agora of Bubastis? How should I translate Herodotus's translation? The premise that Herodotus is using agora only in some limited and specific sense as a marketplace for trade on the grounds that the agora in its fullest sense was unique to the Greeks is untenable. Herodotus's a priori assumptions turn out to be the opposite in the few cases that we can test them in the histories. Nor is his use of the term a simplistic universalism. As we have seen, the agora is a site in which cross-cultural difference can be recognized and perhaps even negotiated or worked around. The solution to translating Herodotus's translation is perhaps to try to follow his lead and not to foreclose possibilities, either through a particularism that rejects, or subordinates difference, or through a notionally liberal universalism that elides difference and hierarchy while reinstating one's own historical values as a Procrustean measure of all things. Seen in these terms, the approach of Herodotus is not unlike the provisional ethical position that Charles Taylor suggested almost 30 years ago in attempting to untangle the politics of recognition in Euro-American liberal democracies. He was working through a series of long-standing debates, still with us, over claims to universal recognition of equality, dignity, and worth, and what the standards for that should be in the context of societies that in various ways have also had to contend with demands for the recognition of difference. Canada happened to be his main case, but it obviously has wider ramifications. Taylor, in that context, which seems a little quaint now in retrospect, given the troubles we're dealing with today, Taylor made a compelling argument for approaching other cultures and societies with a presumption of worth and an openness to a hermeneutic fusion of horizons in the sense outlined by Gadamer. Herodotus was willing to recognize that other places and cultures have their agoras and to put Greek ideas about the agora at risk, making it a less rigidly defined concept, more capacious in its forms, and more susceptible to variation than some moderns may be interested in admitting. Thank you very much.